The Crow is a 2024 action horror film directed by Rupert Sanders. The film is a reboot of the 1994 action thriller starring Brandon Lee, who tragically passed away during the filming of the original. This current iteration of The Crow sees Bill Skarsgård pick up the iconic role. And this time around, he is accompanied by British singer and dancer FKA Twigs, who is taking up the role of Shelley Webster, the late lover of Eric Draven, and this film, upon announcement, received instant backlash from both fans and critics of the original, all of whom called the remake an uninspired remake which is tarnishing the legacy of Brandon Lee. And others just simply hated the design and compared it to the Florida Joker. So now that the film is officially released, is it that bad? Well, let's find out. The film begins with Shelley talking to someone on the phone before she is kidnapped, and then we cut to Shelley, who is running from someone before she bumps into the police and is arrested. We then get a shot of our now heavily tatted up Eric Draven taking a shower before we cut to Serenity Park, which is a correction centre. We then get a scene of Eric getting pressured in prison, and we then see that, Eric ain't really that popular in jail. And he then cuts to his room where he sees Shelley being moved to a different cell, and we're then shown a big city where our main villain of the movie, Mr. Rogue, is just talking to a lady before he has to be taken away to discuss business with the woman from earlier. He tells her that he will kill her, and then he sucks her in the ear, it's a bit weird, and then she's given a knife and she offs herself. We then cut back to Eric and Shelley, who are doing some jumping jacks in the yard, and then Eric's at the stand to eat lunch. Shelley joins him, and the two discuss each other's tattoos, and we then cut to a shot of all of them in a circle. Eric and Shelley slowly get closer to each other, and later that day, Eric is in his cell, and Shelley comes in and sits with him. They're then told that they have a visitor, and they see it's the bad guys. So her and Eric run through the hallways, and the two of them escape prison and hitchhike in a random car, even though they're literally in the prison jumpsuits still. They arrive back in the city, still in their prison jumpsuits, and go to Shelley's apartment. Then have adult funny time in her living room, and the two rip a joint in a bathtub. Then start taking some Molly and a few other drugs, drinking and acting like complete degenerates. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm sure in the original Eric and Shelley were into some weird shit. But not this. Anyway, we then see the villain watching a woman play piano, and he gets a phone call from the woman, who tells him that the police have found the body of Shelley's friend, and I don't think that's much of an issue because they've even paid off the bloody police. But meanwhile, Eric and Shelley are partying with some mates at a lake, and later that evening, Eric and Shelley are in their apartment, and they decide that they're going to go for a walk together, and so they're just on a bridge, and the two then go to a club, but one of Shelley's old acquaintances tells her they're coming for her. Except they aren't zombies, they're, just evil business people. However, as they get back to their apartment, some men appear and suffocate Eric and Shelley, and the two die. However, Eric then appears in a massive ocean and tries to swim to Shelley, but he's unable to reach her before she falls deeper. Eric then swims upwards and into a cave, and when he leaves the cave, he follows an old man, and Eric realizes he's surrounded by crows. The man then explains that when someone dies, their soul is carried by a crow to the land of the dead, but sometimes if something so bad happens that a soul cannot rest until it's over. And Eric believes it's a nightmare, so the man pushes him into a pool of water and he wakes up alive again. Eric then relives some memories of him and Shelley, and the policeman then enters the room and tells Eric to drop his knife before he shoots him. Eric then realizes that his wounds heal, and he begins to fight the officer. He bashes him over the head before stabbing him with the knife. Eric then just heals all his wounds, but in this one, I guess it hurts him when he heals. He didn't really say that in the original. He didn't, scream every time he healed himself, but in this he does. It gets kind of annoying. But yeah, he then leaves the place and walks home. He sees Shelley, who then jumps off a bridge, and he follows her, and he's back to the man in the cave thing. The man then tells Eric that there is a chance for him to get Shelley back, and he realizes that he can't die. So he agrees for the man to send him back to Earth, and he goes to see his friend, and he tells him he needs a gun. Eric then goes to see someone else, and he tells her that he wants to know who killed Shelley, so he can kill them all. She tells him that there is no way he can bring Shelley back, so he gets annoyed and he just sort of walks off, and he then finds some pictures of Shelley and a few other women, along with an ID. Eric then goes to the villain's business and pulls a gun on someone in the car, but when he asks him about the names, he grabs a gun and shoots. He grabs a gun and he's shot. Eric then sees Mr. Rogue and his employees walking into a car, and he shoots at it, and then he gets in the car and begins to kill everyone in the car, but then Eric starts fighting Mr. Rogue, and he falls out the back of the car, heals himself, and then Mr. Rogue arrives at the same woman's apartment, and she tells him what Eric wanted. He then does the same thing where he sort of just, like, sucks on her ear, and then she, like, jumps out of the window and she dies. He then calls someone and tells them to bring Eric to him. Eric then goes after the man from the party, and he tells Eric about Mr. Rogue. Eric then returns to his apartment and puts on the trench coat from earlier, which he just sort of just left on the couch. I don't know why that was like this big moment. Like, you put on a coat, okay, I can take this off and put it back on. It doesn't really change anything. Eric then just goes outside and he walks back to his mate's apartment when suddenly two guys come into the room and choke Eric and shoot his friend. Eric then gets shot with a shotgun, so he goes back to the afterlife, and the man tells him that since he doubted Shelley, he is unable to heal, and so Eric tells him he will give up his soul for Shelley, and so the crows all surround him, and then he smears black blood all over his face, allowing him to go back between worlds, and so Eric comes back to life once again, and he heals himself before he kills all the men in the apartment. And then he's just sort of sat there ripping a J while he, is just on the phone. This was one of the only scenes that I sort of laughed at in the movie, which I don't think... I mean, it was like a little moment of comedy, I guess. But yeah, he sees one of the men's phones telling him to meet Mr. Rogue at the opera. And finally, over an hour and 15 minutes into the bloody movie, Eric dons the makeup and grabs a katana, for some reason, before he sets out to kill Mr. Rogue. So Eric heads to the opera and he begins killing people left, right and centre, and this is probably the only good action sequence in the movie because we get a lot of gore. Eric then gets shot by a bunch of people, but he just continues walking up until he pretends to fall over and die, and then he gets back up and continues to kill everyone. An older man then tries to shoot Eric, but he cuts his arm off before decapitating him, and then he walks into the assistant's little place, I guess, and then he decapitates her off screen. Eric then brings her decapitated heads on stage and he throws them into it. And he then sees Shelley in the crowd and decides to drive away. Eric then walks along the bridge from earlier and lays some flowers down for Shelley, and Eric then goes to Mr. Rogue's mansion and enters his room. He puts the sword to his neck, but Mr. Rogue somehow gets Eric to just be like, "Yeah, it's all good, man," and then he begins to take Eric's healing ability, but Eric grabs him and takes him to the afterlife. Eric then beats him and drowns him in the water, killing him, which was kind of an anticlimactic ending. And Shelley then begins to float to the surface of the water, and Eric grabs her, and they are reunited. Eric and Shelley then have one final kiss, as Shelley is resuscitated in the real world, and we then get a monologue from Eric and Shelley, talking about his love for her, and the film ends with him walking on in the afterlife, a damn soul. Now, does this film hold up to the original, in my opinion? No. However, it isn't as bad as I expected the film to be. It has some alright acting and a pretty good amount of gore. But in my opinion, the highs heavily outweigh the lows. I said that the wrong way around. It has some alright acting and a pretty good amount of gore. However, in my opinion, the lows heavily outweigh the highs. The film's pacing is dreadful. It has like a 5-minute long bloody sex scene in there randomly. And when compared to the original film, there is so much more of a, like, boring romance aspect between Eric and Shelley, rather than focusing on Eric's whole revenge arc of like avenging Shelley and his death. The film instead takes around 30 minutes to get to their death, and it takes like 20 minutes just for them to bloody like fall in love. And not to mention, there's just a lack of likable characters in this one. Whereas the original had Ernie Hudson as the police officer and the young girl who Eric and Shelley were friends to, this film instead features 30 minutes of Eric and Shelley becoming lovers and then dying pretty much. And let's not even mention the massive downgrade in design. Whereas the original film gets a pretty simple design that was also true to the original graphic novel, and even some of the crappy sequels did, like, you know, I'll give him that. This film instead tries to modernize him, and he comes off looking like a mix of a, like, crappy SoundCloud rapper and someone trying really hard to be cool. Bill Skarsgård attempts to bring his own sense of self to the character, but I don't think he's really able to match the same sense of anger and comedy that Brandon Lee was able to do with the character. Frankly, I find myself agreeing with a lot of the people saying that this feels like a massive downgrade. And not only does it not feel the same, but he doesn't even get the full makeup till around an hour and 15 minutes into the film, and that just doesn't feel long enough for a character in the film called the Crow to become the Crow. And the villains in the film as well just feel boring and uninspired. They give the same guy superpowers for some reason, and they say he's made like a deal with the devil, which doesn't fit like this really that much either. Like, the villain in the original Crow didn't have superpowers. Sure, his girlfriend had like voodoo or whatever. He was simply the leader of a crime group who had experience in fighting, and his replacement in this film just doesn't really fit at all. Ultimately, I think the film isn't as bad as I expected, however, it's still bad. The characters feel uninspired. The acting, even Bill Skarsgård, who I usually love in movies, feels forced and uninteresting. And the story as a whole doesn't feel like The Crow. It feels like John Wick mixed with a regenerating samurai. I give it like a 4 out of 10. It isn't bad, but it is nowhere near good. And it frankly feels like not only wasted potential, but also extremely insulting to the original film. And yeah, that's The Crow 2024. A sloppy reboot that really just failed miserably. But what do you guys think about this film if you've seen it? Let me know in the comments below. Are you gonna watch it if you haven't? I mean, I wouldn't really be bothered. It was kind of a waste of money to watch, but hey, at least the people who worked on it are gonna get some money, you know. Oh well. Thanks for watching this video though. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. Until next time, bye bye.